Sometimes I get bored sticking with just the stitches I can document. Honeycomb smocking might as well be synonymous with German Renaissance reenacting. This quintessential technique is often the very first pleatwork embroidery practiced by its participants to decoratively secure the fullness of the fabric in aprons as well as shirt sleeves and collar. The basic stitch presents us with a very documentable option to begin with, but sometimes sticking with the documentable can get a little boring. The little creativity applied to the basic stitch can expand your vocabulary to some not so documentable variations so that you can overcome your boredom and impress your fellow time travelers with your mastery of this technique. Only a small number of surviving 16th century garments that display pleatwork embroidery exist today, so it's pretty astonishing that we have at least one that exhibits the honeycomb smocking stitch. This cuff from a boy's shirt was discovered in 1958 at a monastery in Germany. The honeycomb pattern of stitches are unmistakable and serve as evidence that this type of stitching technology was practiced during the century. Combine this with the woodcuts and paintings depicting honeycomb details on smocks and aprons of the working, middle, and mercenary classes, and it's safe to say that it was a well-known technique in the 16th century. So unlike other smocking stitches, you can actually work the honeycomb stitch moving in either direction. Now for me, it just feels better starting at the right and working towards the left. Now you'll notice that we are starting on fabric that's already been pleated. Now this is indicative of English smocking method. And I'll put a link into the description for how we created these pleats. So I start my stitch at the left side of the work and I come in from the valley between the first and the second pleat. I keep my needle perpendicular and I push it through the second pleat. And remember to be mindful to keep that stitch above your gathering thread. Pull the thread through, and then I'm going to go back to the first pleat. Again, keep the needle perpendicular and I push the needle through the first and the second pleat. Now I want to move down to the next row. This keeps my thread moving in a zigzag formation across the pleats. Because if I went straight across from pleat to pleat, I would end up creating a tension with that thread that would be counter to what the stitch is doing. And this would impede the opening of the stitch, which is indicative of the honeycomb pattern. So I go down just below where I came out of, and I'm going to travel inside the pleat to the next row. I like my honeycomb on the small side, so I'm going to be using half rows for this. So I go down to the half row, I come out of the pleat at the left side and pull through. Next, I move over to the third pleat, push my needle through and pull it taut. Then I'm going to go backwards and with my needle still moving from the left to right, pick up the second and the third pleat. This time I'm going to move back up to the first row. So I push my needle in just above where I came out, move up inside the pleat and come out at the row above and pull the thread taut. And now I start again. Repeat this until you reach the end of the row and tie off. And then you come back to the right side of the work and start on the next row of stitches. And that is the basic honeycomb stitch, which is a very documentable stitch. This is perfect for a garment that you want or need to be historically documentable. Now, the next stitch I want to show you is really more of a design than an actual stitch. I've heard it called broken honeycomb. It uses a basic honeycomb stitch, but instead of continuing on in the next row, you skip a row, a half row, a row and a half, whatever you decide, you're the designer. And this creates a visual texture that adds some variance to the look of the piece. Now, is this a historical stitch? I don't know. I can't prove that it was used in the 16th century, but it is such a simple alteration to something that we know already existed that I like to think that it is plausible that it could have existed. So you really want to be careful about where you start this stitch because it begins at the lower row of the stitch and moves upwards first. I know that sounds really confusing right now, but just stick with me. So what I find useful is I find where my last row has the first two pleats that are stitched together. I'm going to follow those down to the next row where I want my stitching to be. Then I'm going to go down one more half row and move over to where I'm going to begin my first stitch. I want to begin exactly as I showed before and work my way across the row. So I'm just going to be working honeycomb stitches exactly as I began. I'm going to start down and go up, then back down and up. And you'll see that this little break in the row creates long bars of pleats between the rows, and it gives a little variation and texture to the appearance. It's a really simple thing that gives you a lot for a little. Now, you know I love the idea of a historical garment, but sometimes I get bored sticking with just the stitches I can document. You know, when I first began to do things in a more historical manner, I found that I could be quite dogmatic with myself and my choices. I didn't want to do it unless I knew that they did it. But as time went on and my knowledge expanded, and I really began to understand some of the techniques that were used and were available, I realized that everything didn't always have to be unequivocally documentable. Sometimes I want to do more than I can prove existed. And you know, we have such limited knowledge of what everyday people did in the 16th century. So when I'm making something for my own enjoyment, I feel comfortable doing things that could have plausibly been done based on information that we already have and adding in a little creativity. Of course, in order to successfully posit what was plausible, research has to come first. I've spent countless hours researching what did exist, practicing and experimenting with that knowledge, and that helped me develop an understanding for the techniques and what the period items look like, so that I can make reasonable connections and assumptions on what may have been done based on what I can prove was done. So I'm not saying that by being creative, I can make up whatever I want. I'm saying that my research is a foundation for my creativity to spring from. Like the surface honeycomb stitch, done with white thread on a white ground, it could look very much like a basic honeycomb stitch. For this stitch, we're going to start at the left side of the work. Begin by bringing your needle in through the valley between pleat 1 and 2, and with the needle facing left, push the needle through the pleat. And we are ready to begin stitching our first row. So with the thread held above the needle, take a stitch through the second pleat. This time, keep the thread above the needle and move down to the next row. Again, I'm using half rows, so you'll take a stitch through the same pleat you just came out from. And then place the thread below the needle and take a stitch from right to left through the next pleat. With the thread below the needle, move back up to the first row and take a stitch through the pleat you just went through, but in the row above. Now pull your thread taut, and then with the thread above the needle, take a stitch with the needle facing the left through the next pleat. And you just continue across the row until you reach the end. Sure, there are instances where documentation absolutely matters, like participating in a competition or a group that requires it, or for own personal satisfaction. And for me, as long as I'm working with documentable materials and the final project looks like it could have existed in the 16th century based on the information I do have, I'm okay with getting a little creative with the stitches that I use. After all, they were just as creative as any of us today, and they're probably a lot more skilled at the handwork than at least I am. So this honeycomb peak design begins at the end of a base row or a block of basic surface honeycomb. For this demonstration, I am using surface honeycomb, but the idea is pretty much the same for the basic honeycomb as well. The first row of the peak will start under the first cable stitch of your base row or block. And I'll put a card up here with a video that goes into the basic cable stitch. So bring your thread up in the valley just under the first cable of the base row. Push your needle from right to left through the pleat at the left side of the valley, which we will now call pleat 1. Keep your thread below your needle and push your needle through to pleat 2 and pull snug. This creates your first over cable of your surface honeycomb stitch. So the next step is to move down half a row. Keep your thread above the needle and take a stitch through the same pleat you just came out from, just as in a regular surface honeycomb stitch. Continue until you complete 3 surface honeycomb stitches. Then you'll take your thread to the back by pushing the needle through the valley of the last over cable underneath the stitch. And this is where the magic happens. You'll turn the work upside down, and then you'll bring the needle back to the front through the valley above the first over cable. Then you get ready to start your stitch by bringing your needle through the pleat at the left, and then you complete 2 more surface honeycomb stitches on the next row. Then you'll bring your needle to the back again, and then you rotate the work again. From there, you bring the thread back out to the front in the valley under the first under cable and complete 1 more stitch. Then you take it to the back where you tie it off. Then you'll move to the next peak, which starts at your next under cable. And if you're interested in seeing how smocking is used on a real garment, I am working on a smocked apron, so make sure you sign up for notification if you're interested in something like that. Otherwise, here's a video that has more smocking stitches. Happy smocking, and I'll see you in the next one.